Hello, everyone. I'm Steve Handelman. Welcome back to our second day of our webinar series on gun violence and public health. Before I start, I just want to explain, if you see me bending down and you don't see my face, it's because I'm trying to talk into my mic, which is located somewhere in the netherworld of my laptop. I was told that my sound was, I was hard to hear yesterday, so I'm trying to rectify that. If you can't hear me, just let us know by chat, and I'll keep my voice or my face down. But it's not out of any shyness or impoliteness, it's just to make sure you all hear. Um, it will be hard to top yesterday's session. It was a really stimulating one, but I think we can. We've got a really great group of speakers today, and we're going to top it off. We'll round it off with a roundtable of all of you as participants and speakers at the end of the day, which will go to about 5:30, and we'll start talking a little bit about sort of the nitty-gritty of how to cover gun violence in a responsible, accurate, and fact-based way. We have two main sessions that we're doing today. First one is on changing the culture, really how we involve race and class into discussions and coverage on gun violence. And the second one is the politics of gun violence, which is something that is obviously hard to ignore. But before we go any further, I want to introduce our team, which I couldn't do completely yesterday because we started really quickly with the mayor of Baltimore. So first up is Chris Graham, who is our tech producer and all-around fix-it guy and MC. Chris, do you want to say a few words just to give us some rules of the road about what we need to know?
Sure. Just like yesterday, we're going to be posting a lot of information in the chat window. So we just ask that you use the Q&A function to send in your questions. We want as many questions as possible, but please use the Q&A icon at the bottom of your screen, and we'll be giving you information in the chat window. Thank you.
Thank you, Chris. And next up, but certainly not last, is Emily Riley, who has been an intern with the Crime Report for the last year, and she has been excellent. She's a student at the University of Maryland. Her bio is in the bio list that I sent around. It's located in our agenda and conference page section. So Emily, say hello. You just went off the screen. She's being shy. There you are. Hi, Emily. So I mentioned the Crime Report. I just want to, if you'll allow me to, I want to share the screen briefly to explain to you a little bit of who we are and what we do. Here's the Crime Report. Those of you who know us, we come out every day. We're a digest of the daily, the best crime news around the country and the world. And also we have original content, op-eds, research stuff that most people find incredibly useful for their work if they're journalists and researchers. To find the conference page where our conference is listed, you go up to the fellowship section to journalist conferences, and you'll find all of our conferences they've been holding this year and last year. And this week's conference is here. And if you go down here, you'll see the agenda, you'll see the schedule. You'll also see a list of the fellows and speakers, which is down here. So that's your bio. And we'll be running periodically, and we're sustaining periodically a list of resources that you can use for your stories or for further research. So we've begun with a list of some of the things that have been going on around the country, some of the community intervention projects that people have been doing. Some have worked, some haven't worked, and we'll be filing more. We'll also be filing, I haven't got to it yet, some of the handouts, the PowerPoints that we heard yesterday, and you'll be able to use them, of course, as soon as I put them up. It's in this page. We'll also file the videos of each of the panels and sessions that you'll have for future reference. It usually takes about a week or so to format them and get them up. I'll let you all know when they're up and when they're ready. And last but not least, when you guys do any of your stories, either based on what you hear this week or stories in general about gun violence or violence intervention programs that deal with it, please send us a link, and we'll either cross-post it on the Crime Report or we'll post a link on this page. And we do that because one of the important things of what we do as a center is try to bring together journalists from all over the country and all different platforms to trade ideas, to share ideas. They're not sharing, obviously, scoops, but they're sharing ideas and resources that everyone can use. And it's been a very successful way of nurturing really good criminal justice coverage. We've been doing this online for the last year. We've had over 300 journalists who've been participating in our programs. Some of you, in fact, in today's webinar series, this week's webinar series, have been participating in it, so you know the value. So keep this as a good reference, bookmark it, and keep checking back in periodically. Also, one of the perks of being reporting fellows for the CMCJ is that you get a year's free subscription to the crime report. And I'll tell you a bit more about that by email. We send out a daily newsletter about 12 noon or so each day about what's in our site. And we also do a weekly newsletter. It's probably very useful for your work and for your research. Okay, that's all I've got for you now for today, just to give you keep you clued in. And I want to start immediately. As I said, we have a packed program. So I want to turn it over now to Maurice Possley, who is our journalism coordinator. You know him from yesterday, and he will introduce our first panel.
Thanks, Steve. So we have this panel that's going to talk about not only the culture in the streets, but I think we're going to talk a little bit about the way the culture of media covering this issue. And with us today, Pastor Mike McBride, who's really a national leader in the movement to implement public health and community-centered gun violence prevention programs. He's the founder and lead pastor of the Way Church in Berkeley and co-founder of the National Black Brown Gun Violence Prevention Consortium. We have Dr. Johnny Rice II, who is chair and associate professor of criminal justice at Coppin State University, historically Black college and university located in Baltimore City, which Baltimore, of course, was part of our feature yesterday. Before joining Coppin, he worked as a senior program associate at the Vera Institute of Justice in their Center of Victimization and Safety. And certainly not least, Paul David Smith, Director of Reconciliation at the National Network for Safe Communities at John Jay College of Criminal Justice. Previously, Paul worked as a public safety coordinator for the city of Chattanooga. I'd like to start with Pastor Mike, and then Dr. Rice, and then Paul. And everybody's going to give a presentation. I think at least some of you are going to share your screens and then leave time for questions. So take it away, Pastor Mike.
Well, grace and peace to everyone. It is indeed a pleasure and a privilege to be able to hang out with you all on this morning. I'm in California. I know a lot of y'all may have a 3-hour head start on us in other parts of the country, 3 hours, 2 hours, but I am deeply humbled and grateful to spend this time with you all, and to my comrades and friends and colleagues on this panel that we worked literally in the field together for the last decade or so, attempting to mainstream these efforts. I do believe this is arguably the most promising time in quite some time in the history of the work that we've been doing over the last couple of decades. This movement to ensure that gun violence is seen through a public health lens, and to appreciate that there are community-based approaches to addressing the most disruptive force of violence in our communities, or manifestation of violence in our communities, that come through guns. And so the opportunity to help inform you as journalists on various approaches and ways to speak about this, appreciating that any conversation about gun violence is living at an intersection of criminalization, of race, of class, and often of unconscious biases and sensibilities that are often left uninterrogated by the larger public. I often try and kind of contextualize at least this point by using a very important scholar, Khalil Gibran Muhammad, who has produced a very important work that speaks about the way in which dangerousness is over associated with dark-skinned bodies, and how often the media's approach to describing the worst conditions in our communities, when not nuanced and informed by deep, rigorous storytelling, causes folks to make shortcuts about not just the causes of violence, but who is worthy to be saved from the violence that is often a result of generations of disinvestment, systemic and structural oppression and challenges that we all as a country, I think, have to continue to reckon with. There are ways through the faith-based organizing that we have done, and with our strategic partnerships with both community-based violence intervention specialists, we call them VIPs, at least I do, violence intervention prevention specialists, because these are very important people who literally have a deep connection to the ground in ways that many of us do not, right? There's a strategic and important and necessary partnership with law enforcement that must continue to be deeply called into account for its historical abuses, but also engaged in a way where they are seen as part of the conversation, but not the center of a conversation when we talk about violence in the community. And then there's a larger ecosystem of community-based organizations, moral institutions, informal neighborhood change agents, right? Big mamas, grandmothers, longtime peace activists or barbecue cookout leaders, folks that can help us create a deep ecosystem of peace. And so one of the things that I want to share with you is certainly give you a sense of how we've tried to talk about this work and how the work that we've collectively done through the Black, Brown Gun Violence Prevention Consortium, through our national organizing network that is called the Live Free USA Project, how we have influenced the Biden administration to make a historic $5 billion investment into scaling up these strategies with public health at the center, with community-based organizations and leaders braided into that effort, and hopefully with the tax base of our cities, our counties, our state, and certainly our federal government resourcing this effort so we are not dependent upon philanthropic generosity to fund public safety. And I want to close out my remarks by sharing a very powerful poll, a research poll that we did with Celinda Lake and the Lake Research Associates that really helps to capture the broad support for these strategies. We have found that the more the public learns about these community-based strategies, even when they are dubiously attacked as an extension of defund the police or of a soft on crime, or as one police officer used to call this when they talked to me, a hug a thug strategy. Paul may have been in that meeting when they said that. We have found that even when those kinds of descriptions are hurled at these strategies, the public, both Democrat or Democrat, independent, and Republican voters in the key battleground states literally hold their support for these strategies. And so I do hope that that may inform the ways in which we report on violence. I will say to you that for every negative or a story that speaks about the loss of life in a city newspaper or news report, I would hope that we can begin to balance that with a story of the historic and Herculean work being done to prevent more cases of violence. How can we create an environment where the reporting of this work is balanced with the often voluntary work or the courageous work of unarmed citizens who are trained in de-escalation, public health, cognitive behavioral therapy, other peacemaking strategies that are attempting at every part of the prevention, intervention, and services paradigm to reduce violence. I think being able to approach the story making way with this framework will do us a wonderful good in furthering a conversation around addressing public safety without criminalizing or adding to the incarceral system Black and brown young men, women, and families at a disproportionate rate. So just really quickly, I will say the Live Free campaign came into existence in 2010 and 11. It was a result of faith leaders and people with criminal convictions who were tired of burying our children, who were tired of continuously having our gun violence politicized in a way that unleashed a very repressive approach to policing in our communities at the expense of the basic needs needed to stabilize the community. Our work began very seriously to explore the racial intersections of not just policing, but conversations about crime. And we found that when individuals in our communities who were described as perpetrators of violence were continuously described as the language that was literally used by some law enforcement leaders and political leaders and community leaders in our communities as predators, as monsters, as individuals who are literally hunting in the community. That kind of charged language created a inverse kind of relationship between the ability to try and literally figure out ways to save their lives. And why is that important? Because we have found over time that there is a thin line between a perpetrator and a victim of gun violence. If we enter the story of the perpetrator after they pull a trigger, it is likely they have never had anyone enter their life or their story when they were on the other side of that bullet. That many of the young men that we have had to work with literally have holes in their bodies, metal bullets in their bodies. They survived a violent encounter. And so we have found that when we sit down with these young men, when we sit down with their families, there is anger, there is fear, and there is pain that has never been addressed, trauma. And so our work is literally about creating a scaled up national trauma response to violence that has been decades long without a federal, state, or local investment of tax dollars. If I were to ask you, what is the largest provider of mental health services or medication to Black men in this country, I wonder if you would be surprised to learn that it is jail and prisons. That literally Black men have nowhere to go to have their mental health issues dealt with unless they are in custody of the criminal justice system. What then does that create in the community when we literally have men and women who have had violent encounters with other community members or law enforcement, right? Whether they know the individuals or not, these encounters create a level of anger, fear, and pain that produces trauma, mental illness that is often perpetuated within the community because of our proximity to one another and our lack of healing resources and basic needs. Now, some would say that sounds like an excuse. I would say, as a pastor and faith leader, that at some point we must ask ourselves, what is the moral thing to do when we have individuals we know are literally suffering from harm, trauma, and vulnerability? Tracy Mears, a wonderful, wonderful scholar in this work, talks about the tragic reality of safety deprivation in our communities, right? That often we talk about how do we strengthen public safety, but we never talk about how do we address the deprivation of safety in Black and brown communities. One anecdote, and then I'll get to our work that we've done with the White House. A young man who's come through our work here in the Bay Area, his name is Jabari. I'm so excited about how he's joined our national team over the last 4 or 5 years. But he said something very telling. He said most of the time when people are talking about reducing gun violence, they are often talking about how to keep themselves safe, talking about advocates, police, community members. He said, but when are you going to have a conversation about what's going to keep me safe? I'm the one who actually feels unsafe. He said, when you ask me to put my gun down, you're not asking me to be concerned about my safety. You're asking me to put my gun down for your safety. And it was a very telling conversation about at what point, as Devon Bogan and David Muhammad and others in our work say, when are we going to put the actual perpetrator / victim at the center of our public safety conversations and strategies, and not as the target of our intervention? I found that to be a very compelling way to think about this work. In the age of COVID, we have found, and this has been, I think, one of the gifts of our advocacy with the White House and many Democratic and Republican candidates over the last decade, we have found that in the age of COVID, violence has spiked. All kinds of ink has been spilled about what has caused violence to spike. I'll leave that to other folks to address. But what we do know is that the level of trauma in the Black community in particular, given the disproportionate rate of infections, illnesses, and deaths by COVID, has literally created a whole wave of instability in the hierarchies of Black families, Black communities, and Black neighborhoods. Many young men that we've talked to who are now self-medicating. This is one of the most untold stories of this crisis. Many young men are self-medicating because they are grieving the losses of aunties, of big mamas, of fathers, individuals who are in jail, go to jail for a low-level offense and die in jail because of COVID, or come home with a long COVID reality. So COVID has literally destabilized our communities, and the self-medicating has created a shorter fuse that leads to lethal conflicts among young people in our communities. That story is rarely told in the media, which means that we are flattening the experience and the causes of why and how violence happens. Imagine if we told more stories about how COVID is literally devastating the fabric of moral and meaning making in already vulnerable Black communities, already vulnerable brown communities, poor communities, under-resourced communities, and that one of the solutions in the short term is to help stabilize neighborhoods and communities with massive investments in mental health services, grief counseling, ensuring that those who are caught in these violent cycles are targeted not just for punitive responses to the low-level offenses that may escalate to the more lethal conflicts, but we are also investing in strategies that help them understand that there's a pathway out of violence that is as concrete as the violence they are currently caught in. We laid much of this out to Ambassador Susan Rice and the White House after Biden's victory in this last election, and there were many of us who were advocating for a significant investment using the Breaking the Cycle of Violence Act as a framework that we helped to pull together in 2019, a Senate bill and a House bill co-authored by Senator Booker and Representative Horsford out of Las Vegas, a $900 million investment we were asking for over 10 years into community violence intervention. As we continued our work with Ambassador Susan Rice and Special Advisor Cedric Richmond and President Biden, we are thrilled to hear that in April, the president passed executive orders that moved almost $10 billion into eligibility for CVI across the many departments of the White House. It was a similar effort done in the Obama White House around a National Youth Forum violence effort. It was much, much smaller. This effort, $10 billion now available, and hopefully resources being embedded in the reconciliation/infrastructure bill to ensure a multi-year investment into CVI. All of this is so important. Why? Because as we cover the work locally and at the state level, at the federal level, How do we help mainstream the idea that our tax dollars can be used to heal communities that have historically been literally disinvested in and traumatized without end for almost 5 or 6 decades? I mean, the idea that help is on the way, the idea that the American Rescue Plan is literally going to rescue Black America, right? The idea that we now have concrete bipartisan interest in being able to talk about ways to use the strategies that have literally been constructed by people closest to the pain over the last few decades to scale up peace in our communities, I think is a righteous story. The last thing I wanted to share is a survey, a poll that we did that helped to capture this, and I'm glad to share this with everyone on the call and would love to gather Celinda Lake and our communications teams with any of you that would like to further dive down the intricacies of this poll. But there was a poll we did that targeted over 1,000 or so 2022 voters across competitive Senate races. And we found that voters are highly worried about the level of gun violence. 3/4 of voters are concerned about gun violence, and 51% are very concerned. We found that there was a very strong support for federal government funds to be used to implement community-based violence interventions. We also found that more than 8 in 10 Democrats support this approach, as well as 57% of independents and 56% of Republicans. We found this to be a very powerful lesson that we learned. We did not go into it thinking we were going to have this kind of broad support. But as you go down, we start to see that the questions and the data demonstrated to us that there is broad support for federal government providing funds for state and local governments to implement community-based intervention services aimed at reducing gun violence. We found that voters, particularly targeting Senate competitive states, are literally overwhelmingly in support of these kinds of approaches. We found that there are certain kinds of policy reforms that were very popular, expanding emotional support and recovery services for children. We found, oh, I'm sorry, I'm over time. Okay, I'll commission this report to everyone. I'm the Black preacher that's long-winded. I apologize. Thank you, Brother Maurice, for pulling my coattail. Very glad again to share this information with everyone, and look forward to the further conversations that we will have.
Thank you, Pastor Mike. And I always hate to tug on coattails of someone who's so eloquent. I'm going to move to Dr. Rice now, who I think you talked about sharing your screen at some point, but I'd like to hear your perspective, sir.
Great. Well, I just want to first and foremost thank you all for inviting me to this such a meaningful dialogue and conversation when you look at the issue of gun violence and race. I'm going to see if I can share my screen real quick. And so again, on behalf of our president, Anthony Jenkins, and the Coppin State community, I'm honored to be here. The changing the culture, a conversation of race, violence, and justice, I think is very timely. And when I was asked to participate in this panel, one of the things that I believe I can bring is just a instructor or educator's perspective. Coppin State University is a historically Black college located in West Baltimore. We are a stone's throw away from Mondawmin Mall, as well as Douglas High School. I mentioned those two locations because they were settings for the backdrop of incidents that occurred right after Freddie Gray. Freddie Gray's death. And so our campus is located in a community, 21216, that has a high incidence and prevalence of violence, gun violence included. And so my goal as the chair and as an educator, as a criminologist with a focus in victimology, is to really provide grounding in criminal justice theory, policy, research, and practice to undergraduate students and graduate students who are seeking careers in law enforcement, the courts, and corrections, and other supporting roles. But what's also interesting about my students is that they live in many of the communities that we're talking about. And so I'm sure you all heard from our Mayor Brandon Scott, and I commend him on his violence prevention plan and his role in working to make a difference in our city to address gun violence. My students are experts that are close to the story. So what do I mean by that? So each semester, I'll take a poll in my various classes, and I'll have students who have been a victim of gun violence, know someone who's been a victim of gun violence, may have been someone who was involved in a life in which they possessed a gun, and they took advantage of a pathway to change that brought them into our doors at Coppin State University. But again, my goal is to meet these students where they're at. And as we heard earlier, listen to the stories, take those stories to heart, and to use those stories to inform not only policy, research, and practice, but our own education as well. And when I say our own education, I'm not just speaking in reference to educators, but also to the press and the broader community. So these students, many who are first-time college students, first generation, these are individuals who may have experienced many of the systemic barriers and poverty, substance abuse, had relatives and family members that were adversely impacted by mental health and health issues. These are students who, while they bring a lot of insight to gun violence from their own personal lens, they also bring important questions. And they'll say to me, Dr. Rice, why are people of color portrayed so negatively in the media? Why are Black girls who are missing not given the same amount of attention by the media than their racial ethnic counterparts? And what are some of the historical and contemporary factors that can connect or influence this negative perception, such as Black men in particular are violence prone? But I think one of the most significant things that we discuss as a result of these questions is, what can we do individually and collectively on campus and off campus as a community to address these issues? I love being at a HBCU because of our rich history. We have a history of convening leaders, strategizing, and having critical and difficult dialogues. And so discussing white supremacy, discussing racism and sexism, discussing systemic discrimination. Those types of issues are issues that we unpack, and these are issues that are not separate from cases of gun violence. Now, we will have spirited debates in our classes in reference to, accountability versus those other factors that may influence gun use by an offender. But we also discuss how those microaggressions, those preconceived notions can often be adopted by the media and can influence a community. So what do I mean by that? All Black men are not Willie Lynch. All Black men are not Willie Horton. all Black men are not Willie Bosket, right? And so as we have these conversations and explore and examine who each of these figures are, it often connects us to issues that are historic in nature, such as racism and discrimination. And our students feel frustrated that when the press comes in to the community, they have a narrow scope and they do not provide a humanistic lens. So for instance, this is an article, The Demonization and Criminalization of Unarmed Black Male Victims in America. And this is by Falcone and Smiley. It says, Freddie Gray, much of the narrative surrounding him focused on the behavior immediately prior to his arrest. Many considered his behavior suspicious and thereby warranted a presumption of criminality, resulting in examples of micro insults. As you all heard from Pastor Mike, you know, the victimization is not just limited to groups beyond African Americans. Black men as well as Black women are also victims. And so I was really inspired several years ago when the Vera Institute of Justice published Young Men of Color and the Other Side of Harm. And I share this information and publications not only with my students, but I know Vera and other communication officers that they have disseminate this information as well. And it highlights the fact that the same trauma that other groups experience, African Americans experience it as well. And oftentimes it can be compounded when you look at some of these other socioeconomic challenges and systemic barriers that I mentioned earlier. As a criminologist, as a researcher, it's my job to not just discuss the issues of the day with students, but it's important for me to guide them and get them to understand research methodology, empirical research and findings, and legitimate sources beyond social media where they can get information in reference to studies. And so the question we all have, the media has it, we have it at Coppin, our communities have this question: what works? What are strategies? What are programs? What are things that we can do to make a difference? Now, I will say some of my students are, how can I put this? Some of them will read what's in the media and then take the position that nothing is being done. But the same way Pastor Mike highlighted all the different efforts that are taking place in his community, they're also taking place in Baltimore City as well. And so I think that the media and the press would do good justice by highlighting those promising practices programs. And in Baltimore, to be fair, they have done that. Clayton Guyton's Rose Street program converted a row house into a youth center, a row house formerly utilized by drug dealers. Cameron Miles mentoring male teens in the hood, expanding the horizon of young people so that they don't end up in the school to prison pipeline. I have made sure that my students who have an understanding of criminal justice also understand public health, and that prevention at different stages is just as significant, if not more, than some of the criminal justice response efforts. And that's not to diminish law enforcement, because as I said before, I work to prepare my students to advance in those spaces. But as we get outside of our classroom at Coppin and we go to community-based organizations like the Youth Opportunity Center Westside, so our students can get an understanding of people who are committed to engaging young people who would otherwise fall through the safety net if it wasn't for these workforce programs, these mental health programs, these educational programs that meet those young people where they're at. And these are young people who are at risk of delinquency and engaging in more serious violent crime. As I start to move to a close on our comments, I've also had the opportunity to engage students in meaningful research. I'm part of a collaborative that is funded through Thurgood Marshall College Fund, the National Collaboration on Gun Violence Research, and they have funded Thurgood Marshall to conduct qualitative and quantitative research to better understand factors that influence gun possession. So in the community of Jackson, Houston, Baltimore, as well as Delaware, HBCU faculty such as myself, along with students, will be conducting interviews, working with community-based organizations that engage young men, Black males in particular, between the ages of 15 to 24, who are most at risk of possessing a gun or using that firearm. So what are the opportunities for collaboration? What are the opportunities in which we can get this right? So I think that from a university perspective, collaboration and partnership is also always the key. We have served as a convener for consent decree discussions in our city, for community-based organizations that are working to address the gun violence issue. We've also hosted press and other key stakeholders to learn more about different activities that are happening in the community around peace and victim services. Reciprocity. I think it's important that the community and the press develops a healthy relationship in which there's a win-win. So if I share my life story with a journalist and others from the community read it, it should also be connected to resources that can be of benefit. And so if we do an expose on gun violence, it's a 3-part series and we get a national award, have we moved the needle through amplifying this topic to ensure that there are some meaningful resources connected to it and that this isn't just lost in a policy space? Empathy and sensitivity. I've read articles that state a young man was killed in his car, his girlfriend was wounded, and the 5-year-old child was left unharmed. Now, as individuals who look at mental health and therapy, we know that trauma comes in all forms. And so again, it's about having a cross dialogue about what a humanistic approach that has dignity as a part of it, how that can be fomented between community and press. And then lastly, conduit for resources. That's the Scholar Strategy Network. And that is a network that provides experts in different subject matter areas, criminal justice included, and connecting those experts with journalists. That way, journalists can have the context of community, can have the context of the issue, and have research that can support some of the assertions or perspectives that they may share. The last point that I will say is that as a faculty member, as an educator, I say to my students, we know there's disparities in the system. We know some aspects of the system is broke. My goal is to prepare them to not just be a cog in the wheel to continue that downward slide, but my job is to challenge them to be innovative, to be authentic, and to be fearless in terms of addressing sensitive topics such as race, such as ethnicity and its role in how people are perceived in terms of violence, and to make a difference. And so it's been an experience that has been a difficult one at times, but very fulfilling. And I believe that the sharing of information, the amplifying of partnership opportunities between university, community, and journalists can yield some positive results if reciprocity is a part of it. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Dr. Rice. I appreciate that. Paul, what is the National Network for Safe Communities all about, and tell us a little bit what's going on here?
Sure. The National Network for Safe Communities supports strategies that are designed to strengthen communities' capacities to reduce and prevent serious violence, particularly gun violence. The shop works to improve public safety without increasing harm. Matter of fact, works to minimize harm, minimize arrest and incarceration. And we also work to strengthen those disadvantaged communities any way we can, working and operating largely within existing resources. So one of the interventions that we have at the National Network for Safe Communities is the group violence intervention. It's literally an operational approach to reduce violence and build trust between communities and criminal justice agencies as folks work to navigate the criminal legal system. One of the key pieces of our work is enhancing legitimacy. And so that means there's an explicit breaking with past practices that may have been harmful. And those practices can include over-enforcement, under-protection, occupation of communities. And the group violence intervention is based literally on the central fact that communities themselves are not dangerous. However, violence is driven by a small number of people, and then recognizing the power of informal social control. When I say informal social control, it's like Pastor Mike said, it's the pastors in the community, the legit ones, the mothers who've lost children to violence, and having the voice to be able to talk about that, how that has impacted them, how the violence has hurt them, how it hurts the community, and being able to speak from a community level about the violence and having that informal social control that when the folks in the community, the mothers, the mavens of the community, your coaches, your school principals, the librarians, the folks who work at the corner store, Miss What's Her Name from down the street, your grandmothers, and the folks in the community who have the moral standing to help reduce violence with their moral voices, they tend to be the most powerful groups when it comes to the messaging for these individuals who are trying to focus on to save and focus on to help rebuild their lives. And so you have those folks, but recognizing that the trauma and victimization of people involved in violence, because when you look at most individuals who are toting guns, or when you look at the profile of the individual who is the for lack of a better term, the person who committed the shooting. If you look at that person, their profile is exactly like the victim. The victims and those who are doing harm to victims by way of gang violence, group violence, community violence. Almost always the profile doesn't really veer far off from each other. So today's victim on your screen who survives could eventually be tomorrow's shooter on your screen who's getting retaliation for that. Recognizing that most of these individuals did not start off as perpetrators. Almost all of them were victims first and then survivors. So being able to understand and recognize the trauma that they have dealt with and have historically dealt with from even before the actual founding of this country, where you'll find that folks in their community who look like them, when you look at what was written in the framing of the Constitution, they have been considered 3/5 of the person on paper. And then when you look at the practice, it brings into question if that's still the fact. The GBI offers immediate concrete support for safety and critical needs, but recognizing that trauma is not trauma that just happened today. This is historical trauma that is still impactful today. And individuals who are dealing with this type of trauma, it's PTSD, it's not necessarily post-traumatic stress, it's present traumatic stress, and offering concrete support for safety and critical needs for these individuals. Again, focusing on the small number of individuals who are at the highest risk keeps the focus narrow, and it allows us to help cities implement strategies that are focused, balanced, and have procedural justice at the crux of their conversation, and then making sure to use law enforcement sanctions as strategically and sparingly as possible. So the group violence intervention focuses attention on the highest risk groups. So the strategy looks like this: identify the small number of the highest risk people in groups. Who are those people? What does the data show us about them? Who is the coalition of the willing who are willing to focus attention, efforts, resources on rebuilding the community, addressing their trauma, and then making sure to elevate the community to address this public health crisis, and then open lines of direct and respectful communication with that small number of highest risk people. And again, it's respectful communication with those folks. And then being able to have an understanding of the traumas, have an understanding, letting them know that we're establishing a clear standard against violence and for safety. We want to keep people safe, alive, and out of prison, and then establishing standards for their success from people of influential standing within the community, people who they know, and people who, as we're focusing to save lives and help focusing on that small group of individuals, making sure that there's an offer of meaningful support to keep people safe, alive, and out of prison. And then, as we said before, reserving strategic consequences as the absolute last resort. So the partnership that I'm discussing offers a credible community moral message, as I said, but then offers that genuine offer of help. Where law enforcement is a part of this is just letting individuals know their legal exposure, letting them have a credible law enforcement message about consequences for further violence. At these meetings, with these encounters, no one comes in and says, we're going to arrest you on the spot. Here's your rap sheet. Here's why we want to arrest you. It's about showing individuals, here is what we know about you. We also have a record of your past. Here's your legal exposure. We want to make sure that your future is one where you are successful, involves addressing the trauma that you have faced for whatever part of your life, and then making sure that they're in their rightful place within the community. Being able to take this at the same time, when you look at the research, there's copious research that has been done on focused deterrence strategies. So the National Academies of Sciences have found that these innovations produce consistent crime control impacts on gang violence, group violence, and street crime driven by disorderly drug markets. So, and then another study from the Criminology and Public Policy says that focused deterrence interventions achieve a dramatic crime reduction effect while subjecting smaller numbers of people and groups of criminal justice intervention. So what we're looking at is taking that focus on those who drive, who are at the most at risk, and then focusing on them to help keep them safe, alive, and out of prison. Also not negating the fact that they have influentials, people in their lives who are connected to them, who, if they are successful, the trickle up effect works there. And then I'll close with, when you look at the framework of having that direct facilitation and how that works, you're looking at focusing on those who are at highest risk. Shooters are not just perpetrators, as I said. They're overwhelmingly victims of violence too. And amongst these groups and crews, that violence is not distributed equally among them as well. But when these strategies come together, focused deterrent strategies, which include outreach, support, when those come together and bringing them together, you'll see, if you look at the study that was done just most recently by the Council on Criminal Justice, they actually took a look at the violence and found that if you look at the 22 cities who were part of their most recent study, Chicago, which is historically high levels, when you look at the increases in violence over January to June of 2020 and January to June of 2021, the increases were not as significant as, say, in cities like Austin, Pittsburgh, Nashville, Buffalo, because they have strategies that are working together in place with focused deterrence, and they're playing nicely together in the sandlot. So instead of competing for grants and competing for grant monies, they're collaborating and saying, how can we work together and play nicely in the sandlot? So when you look at the smaller increases, while there have been high profile incidents in Chicago, I'll just talk about Chicago as a miniature case study for this call. When you look at the number of groups that are working with focused deterrence and working around focused deterrence, working together to reduce violence and keep those numbers low, you have groups like Live Free Chicago. You have focused deterrence under the violence reduction strategy. There's the Institute for Study and Practice of Nonviolence, Target Area, CRED, Build, Safer, Eddie Bocanegra's, and a group with Ready. When you find these folks under Metropolitan Family Services, which becomes an umbrella for many of these, they're doing custom notifications. Commander Roderick Watson is leading the charge on community policing in new ways, innovative ways in the 3rd District there in Chicago. But then you also have the number of services that have come together, your hospital-based interventions, West Side Health Authority, cognitive behavioral therapy and trauma-focused cognitive behavioral therapy to bring these services to bear, all playing nicely in the sandlot. So while no one agency has all of the answers, while no one strategy can blanket a whole city or even a whole community, when these agencies come together in their jurisdictions and work well together and play nicely in the sandlot and coordinate, work together. In the South Side of Chicago, you have a South Side coordinating meeting that happens once a week, West Side coordinating meeting that happens regularly, where they bring services together and ask, how can we work together to reduce violence? You have your public health, you have your focused deterrence. If all of these work together, while you have, and I'm a former school principal, former educator, I'm a former roots causer, while you have these things that are working and these initiatives that are working on roots causes, that's a slow and steady track that is addressing violence issues. When you're working with focused deterrence, it's on the same course in the same direction, but it's more responsive. And it also is an intentional bringing folks together in the community to proactively address violence as well. You're addressing, if there's an incident that happens today at 9 p.m. in your city, when you're looking at the roots causes and those things, education, after school programming, and making sure that folks have the communities have the things that they need, those are those things that are violence issues. But when you're talking about a violent incident that happens tonight, those roots causes don't address that. But focused deterrence, where you're quickly able to mobilize the community, quickly able to mobilize community moral voices, community-based organizations, entities, agencies, people, and things, and you're able to have responses, like say a custom notification, street outreach, and then being able to take those faith-based leaders with Live Free Chicago, which I was a member of, having those folks to be able to come into the communities, having walking one-stops and mobilizing resources quickly to address incidents, violent incidents, being able to do those. Both tracks are moving in the right direction. One is addressing the issues that happen now. Today is quicker, responsive, and you're able to mobilize those now. And then you have the longer, steady track with those things that are addressing roots causes, the violence incidents, and things like that. While you're able to have both, maintain both, work together in the sandlot, and then intentionally address the legal estrangement that has been perpetrated since, again, the founding of this country. And in many of these communities we work with, addressing the legal estrangement means that you're bringing community in, and it's more than just legitimacy. It's more than just procedural justice. There's an intentionality to being able to acknowledge harm that has been done, and having a reconciliation framework that acknowledges the harm, and that acknowledgement comes from law enforcement. It comes from the powers that be, acknowledge the harm. And then after giving that acknowledgement of harm, allowing the community to have their voice and setting up listening sessions where the powers that be are able to hear from the community that they police and the communities where they work, hear from them and collect their narratives. And as they collect their narratives, have their narratives on the table, generate a consensus around them. These are things that we can all agree on, and then moving them forward and saying, how can we work together to address policy change? And how can we work together to address community norms and mores that need to be addressed together at the community level? So instead of just waiting for legislation to come down from on high, instead of waiting for just things to come down from the pike federally, we're able to also look at things at a local level as well, and then making sure that these agencies, entities, CBOs, and places and things are able to work together to create focused, fair, and balanced, as our colleague Thomas Apt has written, strategies that work together, play nicely in the sandlot. And the National Network for Safe Communities works with all of these to make sure that we are in our rightful places, working together and enhancing legitimacy, building and bolstering the other agencies and groups that work in the community, and then at the same time reducing the harm that has been done to communities. So that's a lot. It's based on the Boston miracle that you saw in the early 90s. Professor David Kennedy was the driver of that. And when you look at how the pandemic, to Pastor Mike's point, when you look at how the pandemic has influenced this, the Council on Criminal Justice, also, if you just take a look at that report, it's fascinating in looking at how the pandemic has contributed to the increase in violence, but it's not exactly clear how. When we don't know how, go to the source and ask the source, not just the resource. Let's pull the folks who can give voice to this and help understand it to the table. And that means getting grassroots, that means getting community level folks, bringing folks together to understand how, why, what, and then developing solutions together. And lastly, I'd just like to comment on something Pastor Mike said. I was in that meeting when someone said, this is a bunch of hug a thug and that kind of thing. In many ways it is. I hug thugs and happy to do so, and happy to say to folks, look, these are my former students. These are members of my community. These are people who we want to save, help. And if somebody says, I don't want to hug the thugs, hand them to me. I'll hug them. And if I can't get them all, I'll pass them to Pastor Mike. And we have a network of folks who hug thugs because our goal is to see our community safe, alive out of prison, reducing harm, and having our voices elevated. The National Network for Safe Communities partners with other agencies to get that done.
Thank you. I don't doubt that there's a lot of people playing well in the sandbox, although sometimes when you look at what's the relationship between Lori Lightfoot and David Brown, you think that maybe there's a timeout in order to some degree, but hopefully they're moving forward there. I wanted to ask and wanted to open, I think there's at least one question asked Pastor Mike. In terms, you're talking about culture, you're also talking about sort of within the police department. And what do you have to do sort of in that direction? And how does that work? Because to change, they're a lot of the, there's a certain amount of people that think the solution here is throw more police into the streets. And when that happens, I think they feel that they're on a mission. And it's not necessarily the same mission that you're talking about.
Well, that's a great question. And I'm going to expose a bit of the tension within the collective field. I think we're all unified around this idea that we must change the way we respond to violent crime. I think we are not always aligned around if there is a percentage of power and how that happens in cities, how much police department power should overtake or overrun that of community. I am one of these folks who, as we have done our work in Oakland averaged an officer-involved shooting every 6 weeks for 30 years, leading up to the 2000 kind of 13, 14 implementation of our open ceasefire strategy. We averaged about 600 shootings per year with about 100 or so fatalities per year. Over 5 years, we were able to literally end officer-involved shootings relatively in Oakland. I think we may have averaged one per year. That was even during the height of the uprisings happening across the country for the very same issue. Our violence began to drop about 20 to 30% per year for several years, and we reached almost 50% reduction after 5 years. That work was done in collaboration with law enforcement, but with lots of tension with law enforcement. Because even though we know there must be a partnership, law enforcement officers, and I would also say often criminologists, largely white men, are not willing to share power with people of color, with Black folks, brown folks, women in this field in a way where they are not the conveners, the arbiters, or the deciders of our work, but rather a part of the collective wisdom of our work. There is a hierarchy when we talk about public safety conversations around value, around expertise. There are those who use their privilege, both in proximity to law enforcement and in proximity to politicians, that cause many of us who are literally living in these neighborhoods, who are providing the direct services, the spiritual, emotional, etc., to families. When folks go home to their own communities, we are there. And so part of the dance with law enforcement has to be one that is always grounded in the truths that are being spoken. We never try to silence law enforcement's voice, but we do not believe law enforcement should be seen as the expert of public safety in a city. They ought to be a part of a collective conversation that has a role, but the power that we must share in a city, to me, is the secret sauce. And in a time when often law enforcement are still resisting common sense reforms in their own professions, it is very difficult, I think, for community members to all of a sudden now believe that they will be the kind of key catalyst for reducing violent crime. We want to be able to say, let's offer a table of leaders that offer these solutions. We don't believe you have to do and abolish the police frame. We think, as we call it, fund peace. We talk about how do we scale up community-based public interventions that keep us as a community stakeholder table together. That, I think, helps us to increase the quote-unquote legitimacy or trust building when we can sit around a table together and create the solutions we seek.
So if I could step in, we have a couple of questions in the chat box that few of the panelists have answered already, but I thought I would just widen it to give everybody a chance to respond. We've got about 10 minutes or so left, and some people may have more questions, but the one question from Elizabeth Joseph, which was answered, I think by Pastor Mike, but I just want to bring it out again, so perhaps the other speakers might respond. Elizabeth asked whether you think that in terms of how journalists cover the issue, that they should commit to reporting with what she calls a dual approach. For example, high weekend gun violence statistics reported by any city should be immediately followed by contextual information, like this comes at a time where the city slashed its social services or the mayor pledges to invest in social services. You would think that's kind of not rocket science, that we would automatically put that in context, but under the pressure of deadlines, I think we often forget. So I'd like to hear what the various speakers think about that. Maybe Dr. Rice and then Paul.
Thank you, Stephen. I would say that sometimes the omission of that contextual information can sometimes sow distrust. And so we saw it during the Baltimore uprising post Freddie Gray, where there was tension between community leaders, residents, not only law enforcement, but with the media. And so I think that, that reciprocity that I talked about earlier, it can be, presented in a way through those stories where the broader context is provided. And so when an issue is provided in a story, let's say the issue is gun violence, and it has a very narrow scope, and it omits other contextual information that can be informative to the community. For those residents that know that contextual information, they're going to be angry because they're going to say that I may not have went to college for journalism, but I lived here 15, 20 years, and I know that the story is much more complex than presented in a short, brief sound bites or in a short story that is written. And so I think to strengthen the relationship between community and journalists and even certain community-based organizations, I think providing that dual approach not only provides grounding and context for the uninformed, but it also strengthens trust with the informed because it says, okay, that person gets it. And I know they get it because when I read the larger story or two distinct stories, I could tell that they understand the broader context of the issue. I'll say this last thing, and this is just something I always remember, and I share this with my class. You know, making sure that we are open-minded to everything, particularly if you're in the field of criminology. And what I mean by that is, you know, not making excuses for crime, but understanding the context. So for example, I believe I share in one of my classes an essay with students. I present first 2 young men shoot at arrival, a baby is shot as a result and dies inadvertently. That was not the target. But then I also shared with them an op-ed from a teacher of one of the gunmen, And she stated in her op-ed, while she was not making any excuse for the young man's violent behavior, she provided the context of the young man with promise that she knew. And she also shared the factors that got him off track, such as gang involvement. And she saw him slip into the abyss of gang life, even with the best efforts of people in the school system. So again, that doesn't make an excuse, but being able to have these parallel understandings of an issue, I think is very helpful to community.
The only thing I would add to that, Stephen, and that's a great question to the journalist who asked it, looking at both, it's absolutely imperative because you must have those things that address root causes. And as you're looking at those things that address root causes, you'll look at the fact that there used to be public health centers in the community, but they went private and they're gone. Look at how many of these communities are food deserts. Look at how many of them are, how many communities does Miss Mabel, 83, have to go catch one bus, take the next bus, catch an Uber, and then walk another half a mile to go get her COVID situations even looked at or get a vaccination. When you're talking about reinvesting in communities, absolutely must happen. When you're talking about context for some shootings, here's what's not context. Oh, but he was a gangster disciple. That's why he was involved in violence. Here's what's not context. This shooting has happened and this happened, but this guy, that's this horrible story. Oh, but he was a member of a Bloods gang. That's not context. What is context is the things that are driving the violence issues that must be addressed, and then how quickly folks can mobilize to address violent incidents. And so making sure to report on this fairly and keeping out, oh, this is a victim of crime, this person has been shot, however, they were a gangster, so that makes it all right. Leave that out of the context. And then lastly, Pastor Mike made a salient point. If for a police chief or police commissioner or police superintendent to just make unilateral decisions for the community and to present them to the community and say, here's what we're doing to you and for you, and then they wonder later on, well, why didn't this work? part of it is because did you invite the community to the table to help shape this policy? And too often, the community decisions that have been made for and about the community are made without the community. Bring the community to the table through a reconciliation process, hear their narratives, hear their stories, and allow that to help shape what happens here in policy. Because too often these same folks, they say, well, we were never at the table. Actually, they were, but they were on the menu. Through these processes, this gives them a chance to be at the table, but seated at the table to help make policy decisions and have their voices heard as decisions are made for, about, but this time with the community.
Thank you, Paul. I think this issue of context is so important. It's probably the key important thing when we talk about, we're really only talking in some ways about gun violence now in a larger way because of the headlines that are talking about the rise, the surge in crime, which is really appears in most headlines, without really understanding what that surge is. I mean, it's 100% increase in murders. In some cities could mean just an increase from 2 to 4. And I think that we want to get back to this, and especially I hope we'll cover this in our final panel of the day in our roundtable, to figure out how to use context in a way that people's eyes won't just cloud over, because they'll think, oh, well, they're just trying to make an excuse for these guys. So, but I'm glad we started the conversation about context. We had one other question that is no longer in the Q&A box from Elizabeth as well, pointing out that yesterday, the mayor's office in Baltimore talked about a program they have, which involves sending city employees out to every spot they call point of trauma where a shooting happened, and to investigate the circumstances, not just about the shooting, but about the neighborhood itself, to see what elements in the immediate vicinity, whether it's poverty or unemployment, a lot that's overfilled with weeds, might have contributed to people's feelings of disconnectedness that added to the trauma of that incident. But we'll have to stop right here, I think, and go back to that issue over the course of the day. So first, I want to thank all of you, Pastor Mike, Paul, Dr. Rice, for really a wonderful hour and panel. And I hope you'll stay with us through the day because we're really interested in hearing your words of wisdom as we continue on. So we'll take a 15-minute break now before we go to the next session. But thank you all.
Many thanks. Many thanks.
Thank you.
Much respect to everyone. Take care.